Hi, I'm Don. Today we're painting a part of a creature caster miniature. We are painting this bone sword and I was aiming for a polished bone look. This painting video is all about layering and the painting of this sword. But this sword is part of this bigger miniature from Creature Caster. We'll have a separate video of the painting of this miniature. First off, before we start discussing and painting the bone sword, this setup might not work for you. This setup of laying down all your colors or all the colors that you plan to use for your layering and then mixing them up and just picking specific mixed up colors that you will use for the layering might not work for you. But I'll tell you later in the video why. In this video, I'll share with you 5 layering tips so that your layering, your painting of a miniature will look better and you'll come up with really nice miniatures. Technically, everything is layering. Like even if you use the airbrush, you're basically layering like paints on top of each other using a different method, using an airbrush. Now, glazing is also technically layering because you're putting thinner paints or semi-transparent paints on top of each other. So everything is technically layering. But in this video, we'll talk about the most basic layering, which is layering with opaque paints. Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to my studio. This channel is supported by all these awesome brands. And of course, this channel won't be possible without the support of my patrons. Now let's start, for context, I live in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, our climate is perfect for life. Like for plants and of course for my fish and even for my paints. Basically, the humidity here allows my paints to be moist on top of my wet palette. Oh, and speaking of wet palette, the first thing that you need to use or you need to have is a wet palette. So that's basically my first tip if you want to do good layering. Oh, dang it. That was a great segue. It's as if I wrote the script. Anyways, using a wet palette will keep your paints moist. So if you're mixing specific colors, those mixtures, those mix of colors will be moist for a while so that you could use them and reuse them while you're painting or while you're doing layering. So that's my first tip. You need to get a wet palette. Depending on the accessibility of the wet palette, basically that will determine your choice. Of course, you could DIY, but then again, if you use the proper wet palettes, the hobby will be a lot more fun. Now, my second tip to be better at layering is to mix as much colors as your comfort zone would allow. By comfort zone, I mean let me explain. Basically, you have a triad, you have a darker color, a base color, and a highlight color. Now, if you're comfortable working with 6 colors as your triad or even triads that doesn't really match homogeneously, you could start with a warm, very dark gray, but using a base color of a cooler gray and then a very warm gray highlight again. You could experiment with your triads, but make sure that while you're learning, you stick to a triad that you're most comfortable with. I'm very excited for War Paints Fanatic because they will release a triad of 6 colors, and those colors are conservative triad. It's a conservative triad because they simply darkened the color of the base color and lightened, from the base color they lightened it, just added a bit of a lighter color, maybe white most likely. So you have a conservative triad that is proven will produce you very, very good layering. So regardless of the amount of paint bottles basically that you're using for your layering, the amount of mixes that you do in between these colors will determine the quality of your layering, which will give you very nice transitions. Now my third tip is to sketch or stipple depending on your comfort zone again while you're doing layering. So stippling and sketching your colors as you build up your layers, you will produce textures, very nice textures, and at the same time, you will build up very nice gradations. My fourth tip is basically focus on layering, especially if you're just starting to learn and really refine your layering technique. So focus on layering and do not glaze while building up your layers. Of course, once you get really good and comfortable with layering, you could do glaze layering, or you could do a layer and then glaze on top of that and then layer again and glaze. So you could basically sketch and glaze or layer and blend as you go. You could only do this and really be flexible while you do layering if you're very comfortable with basic opaque colors layering. Also, if you're really comfortable or good with the airbrush, you have really good airbrush control, or you're just painting like a dominant color of a model like a ultramarine, which is basically just blue, you could use the airbrush for your basic layering. Or you could apply it with a brush, a certain color, and then use the airbrush to blend it with the previous color if you have very good control with your airbrush. But then again, if you're still learning and really refining your layering, I would recommend not to use an airbrush and start with brushes. It's similar to drawing. It's like using pencils for drawing while learning, and then you move up to inks or whatsoever medium. With this one, with painting, you could start with brushes, and basically once you get comfortable with the concept, the technique, and the application of paints with brushes, then you move up to airbrushes. Now, my last tip, basically I always say this in my videos, even my really old videos, is that fine or very fine strokes with your brush for the highlight colors define the quality of your painting. As you can see in the video right now, as you paint very fine highlight colors, you kind of build up very nice interweaving highlights that will look so good, especially from like a little afar, not the close-ups that you see in the video. So what you see in the video right now is all layering. I did not do glazes. I did not even thin the paint so that I can do like glaze layering, especially since I'm not using my cuttlefish colors. You all know, especially if you're an old time or kind of old subscriber, or especially if you're a patron, I really love glaze layering. That means that I thin down my paints a little bit, although I cheat because I use pre-glazed paints like cuttlefish colors, and I kind of build up thinner layers of paint on top of each other. In this manner, I produce better, way better transitions. So after layering from base colors, with this one we started with black and slowly built up our base color from black, and then our midtones, and then eventually our highlights. Your layering should look good before you like switch to glazing. This is actually our tip number 4. Basically what I'm saying is that you shouldn't be dependent of the idea that you could use washes and glazes to refine your layering. But once you're happy with your basic layering, of course, fat glazes and thin glazes or even washes and speed paints will make your layering look better. The glazes or the washes or speed paints that kind of filters your painting a lot more than normal washes will give you a better looking transition or will basically soften your layering. Now here's a bonus tip since you've watched the video up to this point. You do not need to use the same colors that you use for layering as your glazes. This is actually my recommendation. Use different shades or different washes or basically different colors. This new glazes, new colors will add more color depth to your painting, will also smoothen down your layering, and of course, add more interest to your painting. Now it's time for our actual tip time. Now, before our reveal, a ton of thanks to all my patrons, because without my patrons, this channel won't be possible. Oh, by the way, if you plan to not thin down, but if you plan to glaze with your highlight colors like ivory, off-white, white gray, and all those colors, you should thin it down a bit more so that it won't produce a chalky finish. Oh, by the way, although I have a ton of glazing videos, basically if you're applying really thin glazes or thick glazes, make sure that you allow the paints to dry in between coats. Now, going back to what I said at the start of the video, I said that this setup of laying down all your colors and mixing them together and using them for your layering might not work for you. Basically, this setup might not work for you, especially if you have a very dry summer, like very less humid climate, because the paints, especially the highlight colors, will kind of start to dry as you do the layering with the darker colors. So you don't really need to lay them down like in this linear manner because you might get frustrated, so I can't really assure you that you will enjoy your layering process because the paints will start to dry as you build up your layers. So layering can be difficult, can be hard, and is definitely very time consuming. However, layering can be very satisfying. Also, make sure that you follow my 5 tips, which is number 1, use a wet palette. Number 2, mix as much colors as your comfort zone would allow. Number 3, apply your layering via sketching and stippling so that you produce textures as you build up your gradations. Number 4, focus on just layering, basic layering, and do not glaze while you're building up your layers. Number 5, very fine strokes as you paint or layer your highlights will determine the quality of your layering. That's it, Pansit. I hope you liked the video and watch these other videos.